Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, I am going to discuss about one of the most important topics, that is the key concepts or key components of Spring Security and basic workflow. See here, this is the Spring Security basic workflow diagram. When an end user sends a request or the RESTful client sends a request to our REST application, when the client sends a request to our REST application, the very first component in Spring Security that intercepts the request is Authentication Filter. This is the one. The Authentication Filter is a servlet filter class that will see if the user has authenticated. It is a servlet filter class. It will see that the user must and should be authenticated. Here I am having the Authentication Filter class that extends the once per request filter. This Authentication Filter will check that the user has been authenticated or not. If not, it will send the request to the Authentication Manager. If not, it will send the request to the Authentication Manager. This Authentication Manager is the interface where it has the authenticate method that returns the authentication object. This Authentication Manager will check if the details sent by the user are correct. The username and password are valid or not. The Authentication Manager uses the Authentication Provider. This Authentication Manager uses the Authentication Provider. For example, here I am clicking this and clicking on Open Implementation. This is the interface, so it is having one abstract method, so-called authenticated method. This interface has been implemented by the Provider Manager class. This is the Provider Manager class. In the Provider Manager class, we have the implementation for that method, which is there in the Authentication Manager interface. All the logic has been written here. This returns the authentication object. This returns the authentication object here. See here. This Authentication Manager uses the Authentication Provider. This is the Authentication Provider class. This is where we define the login logic or the authentication logic. We will provide all the login logic or the authentication logic here in this Authentication Provider. The authentication will not fetch the user details. That means the person who is going to be authenticated, who is going to be logging, the person username and password credentials, it will not fetch from the database or LDAP or in memory. It will use the user detail service. For that purpose, it will use the user detail service to fetch the details from the database. In the user detail service, we will have a method called load user by username. By using that method, we will fetch all the user details from the database. It will also use the password encoder, like decrypt password encoder, to encode the incoming password. First, the incoming password from the user is encoded and the comparison is done. That means the incoming password has been encoded and it is saved in the database, and that password and the password that we are entering, both the passwords will be compared, and if both the passwords are set to be true or set to be same, then the authentication will be successful. And another one, we have the Authentication Provider. I'm opening the implementation. See here, authentication provider is the interface where we have the authenticate method. Here I am opening the implementation for this. This authentication provider will check the username and password details that are correct. Then it will send the appropriate response back to the authentication manager. Then the authentication manager will hand over to the authentication filter. See here, we have the abstract user details authentication provider. This abstract user details authentication provider is the class that implements the authentication, authentication provider. See here, this is the flow. This abstract user details authentication provider is the class. This class implements the authentication provider. In the authentication provider, we have the method so called authenticate that returns the authentication object. This abstract user details authentication provider will have all the internal logic like username password authentication token, which in the see here, I am opening the implementation. Username password authentication token. This username password authentication token, this token will be authenticated if the username password authentication token is set to be true. In the username password authentication token will provide all the username and the authorities, that means the roles, and if the username password authentication is set to be true, then that means the credentials, the username password credentials are correct. Then it will return a Boolean value, and that Boolean value if the Boolean value is true, then the flag is set to be true, and the token will be saved in the security context holder. That authentication object will be saved in the security context holder. Like see here, we have the DAO authentication provider. This is the flow. This DAO authentication provider is the class. This class extends the abstract user details authentication provider, where all the logic resides here. In the DAO authentication provider, we have the user detail service. In the user detail service, we have the load user by username. This load user by username details returns the user details, complete user details. This load user by username will fetch the username from the database, and also it will fetch the username and also the password from the database, and it will validate. If the authentication details are okay, then the authentication is succeeded. The authentication filter will use the authentication success handler. If the authentication is set to be true and the authentication is successful, then the successful authentication object will be returned by the authentication manager to the authentication filter. And this authentication filter, what it will do is, the authentication filter will use the authentication success handler and stores the authentication information, the user details, in a security context. If the authentication has failed, it will use the authentication failure handler. See here. If the authentication filter will use the authentication success handler and stores the authentication information, the user details information, in a security context. The security context is the class will store all the details in the security context. If the authentication has failed, it will use the authentication failure handler to send the appropriate response back to the client. See here, authentication success handler and the authentication failure handler. If the authentication has failed, it will return the appropriate message. That means unauthorized, not valid, or the authentication has said to be failed. It will return some message by the authentication failure handler. By the authentication failure handler. In this way, this is the complete process and workflow of the Spring Security. Thank you.